The birth happened at 3:47 station time, in a medical bay that smelled of recycled oxygen and antiseptic foam, on a colony ship called the Perseverance that had been in transit for 11 years and had never once given the Galactic Council reason to worry. The attending physician was Dr. Maren Voss. She had delivered 41 babies on the Perseverance since leaving Earth. She had seen blue eyes and brown eyes and eyes so dark they swallowed the light. She had never seen eyes like these. The baby was healthy, 7 pounds 4 ounces, good lung capacity, the whole bay knew it. The mother, Sasha Aldrich, was 29 years old, a hydroponics engineer, married to a structural welder named Dav. The pregnancy had been unremarkable. The delivery had been unremarkable. And then the baby opened its eyes. They were gold. Not hazel, not amber. Gold, the way the sun is gold if you look at it at the wrong angle from the wrong orbit. That specific savage light that registers in your hindbrain as something older than language. The pupils were vertical, long, narrow, elliptical, and they caught the overhead lights and split them into something that had no business existing behind a human face. Maren stood very still. The baby blinked, yawned, made a sound like all babies make, a small wet protest at the indignity of being born. Sasha reached for her and Maren did not stop her because what was she going to say? Because how do you explain to a mother that her daughter's eyes look like something that shouldn't be possible, look like something the xenobiologists on the upper decks had been arguing about for 30 years, look like she caught herself? She handed the baby to Sasha. She smiled. She said congratulations in a voice that sounded almost right. Then she went to her office and sat in the dark for 4 minutes, and then she filed the routine birth report and included, in the section marked Notable Observations, a single factual sentence about the infant's ocular pigmentation and pupil morphology. She did not know that within 6 minutes of that report transmitting, it would be flagged by 3 separate council monitoring systems. She did not know that within 9 minutes, a command would originate from the council relay station at Proxima Junction and reach the Perseverance's communication array before she had finished her 4th minute sitting in the dark. She did not know any of it, not yet. The order came through official channels, which was how all the worst things arrived. It came addressed to Captain Rule Brandt, routed through the standard council administrative frequency, and it was marked Priority Alpha, which was a classification Brandt had seen exactly twice in his 11 years as captain of the Perseverance. Once during a hull breach drill, and once when a crew member had died of an unclassified pathogen, and the council had wanted the body incinerated before anyone had a chance to ask questions. He read it 3 times. The order was simple. Medical report filed at 3:47 station time was to be considered classified. No copies were to be distributed. No crew members were to discuss the birth or the infant's condition. Standard congratulatory announcement was to be made over ship comms in the morning. Healthy baby, mother and child doing well, the colony grows. The infant was to be transferred to Facility 7 within 72 hours of arrival at Kepler Station, for what the order called routine developmental assessment. Facility 7 did not appear in any document Brandt had ever been given access to. He sat with the order for a long time. Outside his porthole, which looked out on nothing but transit space and the occasional smear of distant light that might be a star or might be a sensor artifact, the Perseverance breathed and hummed and carried its 3,000 people through the dark. He thought about Sasha Aldrich, who had waited 11 years to raise her child in a new world. He thought about eyes that caught light wrong. Then he called his executive officer, Commander Yale Tors, and told her to come to his office immediately and speak to no one on the way. Tors was 44 and had spent most of her adult life in council service. She had cropped gray hair and a voice like someone who had stopped being surprised by things years ago, and when Brandt showed her the order she read it once, set it down and said, Facility 7. You've heard of it. No, she said, that's the problem. He waited. I've had council clearance for 18 years, she said. I've been on 3 colony runs, 2 survey missions, and a border enforcement deployment in the Tau Ceti sector where I saw things that were officially redacted before I finished writing my report. I know all the facilities. 7 through 12 are medical research stations in the outer Kepler belt. I know their directors, their budget lines, their inspection schedules. She tapped the order with one finger. There is no Facility 7. Brandt looked at the document again. It's right there. Something is right there, Torres said. Whatever it is, it didn't exist 6 minutes ago, which means someone built it into the registry in the time between your doctor's report transmitting and this order arriving. She paused. That's not a medical assessment, Captain. That's a disappearance with paperwork. In the silence that followed, they could hear the ship. The distant mechanical pulse of it, the life support cycling, the soft percussion of 3,000 people sleeping and waking and going about the ordinary work of being alive in transit. Somewhere in the medical bay, a woman named Sasha was holding her daughter and probably counting her fingers and toes. What do the eyes mean? Brandt asked. Torres shook her head. I don't know. But the council does. The council, she said carefully, clearly knows enough to be afraid. Dr. Maren Voss was not supposed to be difficult. She understood this about herself the way she understood most things, with clinical precision and zero self-pity. She was not a political person. She had not joined the Colonial Medical Corps to make trouble. She had joined because she was good at delivering babies and keeping people alive in the particular cramped and airless and psychologically brutal conditions of long-haul transit, and because someone had to do it and she was available. But she was also the doctor who had filed the report, and she was the doctor who had seen the eyes, and she was therefore the first person Torres came to find at 600 station time, when the Perseverance's corridors were starting to fill with the morning shift, and the smell of the communal kitchen was drifting through the ventilation. Tell me exactly what you observed, Torres said. They were in Maren's office with the door locked. Maren told her. Torres listened without interrupting. When Maren finished, Torres said, Have you told anyone else? Number should I have? The council has ordered silence, Torres said. No crew member is to discuss the infant's condition. Maren stared at her. She's a baby. I know. She was born 6 hours ago. She's healthy. Her Apgar score was 9 out of 10. She's nursing well. She has unusual eyes, that's it. That's the entirety of the situation. I know, Torres said again, and her voice hadn't changed. It stayed level and steady, but something in it shifted slightly, the way ice shifts before it breaks. I know that. And I also know that whatever is in that council order arrived faster than any routine administrative response has any business arriving, which means someone at Proxima Junction was watching the medical transmissions from this ship in real time and had a protocol prepared. She paused. What do you know about human genetic expression in deep transit? Maren blinked. Some drift is expected. Radiation exposure, transit stress, epigenetic markers. Nothing that would, she stopped. She thought about the eyes, gold, vertical pupils, the way they had caught the light. Nothing documented. No, Torres said, nothing documented. The word documented sat between them like a stone in still water. How many births like this have there been? Maren asked. Torres said, I don't know, but the speed of that response suggests the council has a standing protocol. Standing protocols are for recurring situations. She met Maren's eyes. They've seen this before. There was a man in the crew named Oscar Fame. He was 61 years old, technically retired, officially listed as a historical archive specialist, which was the kind of job title that meant he had done things for the council that couldn't be put in any more specific terms. He spent most of his days in the ship's library, which was actually a converted storage compartment on Deck 7, with 3 reading terminals, and a surprisingly good collection of pre-departure Earth literature. And he drank too much coffee and spoke to almost no one, and had exactly the manner of a person who had made peace with knowing too much. Tors found him at 800. He was reading something on the terminal and did not look up when she came in, which she had come to understand meant he had been expecting her. "Facility 7, she said. He turned a page on the terminal. "Sit down, Commander." She sat. "How much do you know about the Accord of Silence?" he asked. "The species contact protocols," she said. "Standard xenobiological engagement framework. Any evidence of prior non-human influence on human development is to be—" She stopped. The word came back to her. Suppressed. The actual word in the Accord was suppressed. She had read it once in a training document years ago, and she had understood it in the abstract way that legal framework is understood when you believe you will never encounter the specific situation it addresses. "Oh," she said. Oscar turned another page. "The Council has been aware for approximately 40 years of evidence suggesting that baseline human genetics contains sequences that do not originate from any identifiable ancestral lineage, sequences that appear to be dormant, latent." He paused. "Occasionally, under specific conditions, long transit, certain radiation profiles, what one researcher called accumulated becoming, those sequences express." "Express as what?" Tors asked, though she already knew, in the way you know a thing before you're told it because the shape of it is already visible. "As traits," Oscar said. "Biological traits that correspond, in at least 3 recorded cases, to morphological features associated with species the Council has classified as extinct or mythological, including—" He paused again. He was a man who paused. It was how he managed what he knew, parceled it out in units his own equilibrium could handle. "Including the Vor, which the Council officially maintains never existed." The Vor. Tors sat very still. Even she, with her 18 years of clearance, had only heard the name in the hushed sideways manner that powerful things are discussed when powerful things don't want to be seen to exist. The Vor were, depending on which fragments of pre-suppression scholarship you happen to have read, either a mythological dragon equivalent from a dozen separate species-independent traditions, 2, consistent across too many unconnected cultures to be coincidence, or an actual species that had existed and had been systematically removed from the record. Old. Impossibly old. The kind of old that made the current galactic civilizations look like children who had been playing at history for 5 minutes. "The baby," Tors said. "As the eyes," Oscar said, "that 3 separate xenobiological researchers were quietly retired for attempting to document." He closed the terminal. "The Council's position is that the Vor are mythological, that the genetic sequences are noise, that the expressions are anomalies with no significance, and that any infant displaying such traits is to be assessed at a facility that does not officially exist." And then, he paused one final time. "The Council's position is that the assessments are medical in nature." "And the reality?" "In 40 years," Oscar said, "no infant transferred to a facility for developmental assessment has ever been documented in any subsequent record. Not in the colony registries, not in the transit logs, not in any birth or death or census record accessible to anyone with less than level 9 clearance." His voice was entirely flat. "I have never held level 9 clearance." Captain Rule Brandt had been a Council loyalist his entire adult life. This was not because he was unthinking. He was, by any measure, a careful and perceptive man, but because the Council, in his experience, had been broadly correct about the things that mattered. The colony programs worked. The transit safety record was better than anything humanity had managed in its pre-Council history. The peace, fragile and imperfect, and maintained by the kind of agreements that required you not to look too closely at the machinery, held. He had built his professional life on the premise that the institution, whatever its flaws, was oriented toward human survival and flourishing. He was sitting with that premise now, examining it, turning it over in his hands the way you turn over a tool you've been using for years and suddenly notice is lighter than it should be, wondering what's been taken out of it. Tors had come back to him at 1100 and told him what Oscar had said. He had listened to all of it. He had not interrupted. He had then sat quietly for a while, looking out at the dark. "There's a woman," he said finally, "in my ship who has just had a baby." "Yes," Tors said. "And the council wants to take that baby within 72 hours of arrival at Kepler Station, which is in 18 days. And nobody who has been taken to Facility 7 has been documented again, no." He looked at his hands. He was 57 years old and he had served the council for 31 of those years, and he had a pension and a commendation, and a letter from the Director of Colonial Operations thanking him for his outstanding service, which was framed on the wall of this office. He looked at that too. "Pull up everything we have on the Perseverance's communication array," he said. Tors very carefully did not smile. "Marin Voss already thought of that," she said. "She's been in the engineering bay for the past 2 hours. What Marin had thought of was this. The Council's order to maintain silence was enforceable as long as the Perseverance's communication array was transmitting on standard Council frequencies. Standard Council frequencies were monitored. If you tried to send a non-compliant transmission on a standard frequency, the relay stations would flag it, and a second set of orders would arrive, and then a Council enforcement vessel would be dispatched, and things would get much worse. But the Perseverance was also equipped, as all colony ships were, with emergency broadcast capability on the old pre-Council open frequencies, the frequencies that predated the Council's communication network, the ones the early settlers had used before the Council existed, when humanity was going into space without anyone's permission and without anyone's oversight. Just the raw, stubborn, species-wide insistence on going farther and seeing what was out there. Those frequencies were for emergencies. They were not monitored, because the Council's position was that emergencies requiring open broadcast did not occur in a well-managed transit program. Marin had been in the engineering bay with the chief communications engineer, a 40-year-old Kenyan woman named Dodo Kariuki, who had been on colony runs for 16 years and who had listened to the full situation with complete stillness, and then said, in a voice of perfect calm, "We could route it through the emergency array. If we add a packet signature that matches a Class 2 hull integrity alert, it gets priority relay across every station in the sector before anyone realizes it isn't a structural emergency." "Is that legal?" Marin asked. Dodo had looked at her. "I'm going to need about 4 hours. The hard thing, harder than any of the logistics, harder than the routing and the signal masking and the packet signatures, was Sasha." Marin went to her at 1400. Sasha was sitting up in the medical bay, the baby in her arms, Dav beside her on the chair that visitors always took because there was only one. The baby was asleep. In the soft light of the medical bay, her eyes were closed, and she looked like every other newborn that Marin had ever delivered. Small and complete and entirely herself. Some new specific fact about the universe that had not existed 36 hours ago. "I need to tell you something," Marin said. She told them everything. She had debated with herself about how much, and then she had decided that the thing she owed this woman was the same thing she owed every patient. The complete truth, delivered without softening, because a person can only make a real decision when they have real information. Sasha listened. Her face did a number of things. She held the baby tighter, which was the first thing. Then she looked at Dav, and he had already moved his chair closer, which was the second thing. And then she said something that Marin had not expected at all. "I know," Sasha said. I know something is different about her. I've known since they put her in my arms." She looked at me. She paused. She looked at me the way I don't know how to explain it, like she already knew me, like she was older than she is and she'd been waiting. She looked down at the sleeping face. I named her Vale. I don't know why, it just came to me. Marin stood very still, because Vale was not a name from any culture she recognized. And she thought of Oscar saying the vor, and she thought about the things you know before you're told them. What are our options? Dav asked. His voice was level. He was a structural welder, a practical man, a man whose job was understanding what holds things together and what takes them apart, and he was applying that same attention to this problem. Tell us. They had 18 days until Kepler Station. In those 18 days, the Perseverance's emergency broadcast array sent 47 transmissions on the old pre-council frequencies. Each one was packet-signed as a different category of infrastructure alert. Each one contained, buried in the technical metadata, the full council order and Oscar's documented history, and the birth record, and 3 hours of continuous video footage that Dodo had routed through the medical bay's standard monitoring system. The footage showed a baby. A healthy, ordinary, laughing baby who happened to have extraordinary eyes. It showed her sleeping in her mother's arms. It showed her tracking a light with those golden vertical pupilled eyes with an attention and focus that no 6-day-old infant should have been capable of, and which was either terrifying or wonderful depending on who you were. It showed Sasha nursing her and Dav reading to her from a battered physical book he'd carried 11 years in his kit bag. It showed a child. The council's monitoring systems caught the first transmission on day 3. The second enforcement order arrived within hours. Cease all unauthorized broadcasts. Mandatory compliance review. Council representative to be assigned upon arrival at Kepler Station. Possible criminal charges for communications interference. The third transmission went out the morning after the second enforcement order arrived. Tors watched the enforcement orders accumulate on her terminal. She thought about something Oscar had said near the end of their conversation, almost as an afterthought. The accord of silence only functions as long as there is silence. She thought about that. On day 7, the first response came back from outside. It came in on the same old open frequencies. Signal bounced from a relay station in the outer sector that was not a council installation, and it was not from a government or a fleet or an institution of any kind. It was from a colony ship called the Steadfast Promise, which had been in transit for 14 years and had 4,000 people aboard, and had, according to its captain, one child with silver eyes that reflected light in a way that had no medical explanation. A child who had been on a developmental assessment schedule for Facility 7 since her 3rd birthday, 2 years ago. The captain of the Steadfast Promise had a name, Amara Diallo, and she had been carrying this for 2 years in the silence the council had required of her. And she had a voice like someone who had been very patient for a very long time, and was no longer willing to be. The Steadfast Promise joined the transmission network. On day 9, they heard from the Kairos light. On day 11, from 2 more ships whose names Marin wrote down in a physical notebook because she didn't trust the digital record. On day 13, from a colony on Kepler 442b that had been established for 6 years and had 17 children with various combinations of the documented traits. The eyes, the reflexes, the strange accelerated pattern recognition, the thing that the researchers who had been quietly retired had documented and then been prevented from publishing, and whose colony administrator had been in possession of a transfer order for all 17 children for 8 months, and had been refusing to comply, and had been waiting, apparently, for exactly this moment. On day 14, a council enforcement vessel appeared on the Perseverance's long-range sensors. It was a fast ship, military class, 3 days out. Brant looked at the sensors and thought about what he was made of. The thing about Ruel Brant was that he understood systems. He had spent his career inside the council's system, which meant he understood its pressure points in the way you only understand a structure when you have lived inside it for 30 years. He knew which parts held load and which were decorative. He knew where the weight was. He sent a transmission to the enforcement vessel, on the official council frequency, fully compliant, properly logged. It was addressed to whoever was in command. It said, "We are a colony ship carrying 3,000 colonists, including 212 children, including 47 children currently enrolled in developmental assessment programs, and we are prepared to submit to full council review upon arrival at Kepler Station." It said, "We request that the review be conducted in open session, with representatives from the Colonial Charter present, as is our right under Article 7 of the Colonial Compact, which predates the Accord of Silence and has not been suspended." Article 7 said that any action affecting the status of colonial citizens, including but not limited to transfer orders and developmental assessments, was subject to review by a full panel of colonial representatives if the affected citizens or their guardians requested it. The Council had never suspended Article 7. They had simply never expected anyone to invoke it in this context, because invoking it required knowing what was happening, and the Accord of Silence was supposed to prevent that. Brant sent the same transmission, with the Article 7 citation, to every colonial charter representative he could raise on the open frequencies. He had Tors compose it and Dodo transmit it and Oscar review the legal language, and when they were done, it was the tightest, cleanest piece of procedural documentation Brant had ever put his name to. Then he went to the medical bay. Vale was 12 days old. She was awake. Brant stood at the edge of the room. He had not intended to stay long. He had come, he told himself, to check in with the medical team, to verify the situation, to do the things a captain does when his ship is navigating something unprecedented. But then Sasha had seen him and said, "Come in," and so he had come in. The baby looked at him. He had been told about the eyes. You could know a thing and still be entirely unprepared for it. The gold was different in person. In the video transmissions it was striking. In the room it was, he searched for the word and found it present. The eyes were entirely present. They engaged with you the way adult eyes engage, with a quality of attention that recognized you as a specific fact rather than a general shape. He had the disorienting feeling, standing there, that she was learning him, filing him away, deciding something. "She does that," Sasha said, watching his face. "It's okay, she doesn't scare me." "What does she do?" Brant asked. "She's just paying attention," Sasha said. "That's all. She pays attention better than anything I've ever seen." She paused. "She's going to be something remarkable." Brant looked at the child. He thought about the council's word, assessment, and what was behind it, and what Oscar had said about 40 years of children who hadn't been documented again, and he thought about what remarkable means and what the world does to remarkable things it doesn't understand. "Yes," he said, "she is." He left before the thing in his chest became anything he'd have to manage in front of them. The council enforcement vessel was called the Clarity. It was commanded by an officer named Deputy Director Hahn, who was 63 years old and had spent 30 years in council administrative enforcement, and who did not appear, in any of her transmissions, to have experienced any significant self-doubt. Her first transmission told them to cease unauthorized communications. Her second told them to power down the emergency array. Her third cited specific violations and referenced the criminal exposure of every crew member involved. Brant answered each one on the official frequency, citing Article 7, requesting open review, and including the growing list of colony ships and stations that had filed their own Article 7 review requests in the past 6 days. On the 14th day, the Clarity was 36 hours out. Brant had 41 Article 7 filings sitting in the transmission queue, from ships and colonies and stations spread across 2 sectors. Dodo had them all formatted identically. Same header, same legal citation, same attached documentation. Because the point was not just the content, the point was the pattern, the visible, undeniable accumulation of things that were supposed to not exist. And then the clarity changed course. Brant was on the bridge when it happened. He was watching the sensors, and Tors was beside him, and they both saw it at the same time. The enforcement vessel, which had been on an intercept trajectory for 4 days, altered its heading by 11 degrees and began to decelerate. "They're not stopping," Tors said. She was looking at the readout. "They're slowing down, but the intercept." "They're not intercepting us," Brant said. He stared at the sensor data, doing the math in his head. "That's a holding pattern. They're waiting." For what? He knew what. He had been waiting for it too, in the background, without letting himself count on it, because you can do everything right and the machinery can still grind you down. But sometimes you do everything right and the machinery hesitates. "Someone higher than Han," he said. The message came through at 200 station time on the 15th day. It was on the official council frequency, encrypted at a level Brant had never encountered, which meant it had originated somewhere above the deputy director's pay grade. It was addressed to Brant personally, which was either a professional courtesy or an attempt to make this feel more manageable than it was. It was not from the director of colonial operations, whose name was on the commendation framed on Brant's wall. It was from someone called the Council Arbiter for Genetic Accord Review, which was a title that suggested a position that had never been used before or had been kept very carefully out of view. The message said, "We are aware of the Article 7 filings. We are aware of the scope of the situation as it currently stands. We are requesting a communication hold of 48 hours while the Council conducts an internal review." It did not say "please stop transmitting." It said requesting a hold. The language had changed. Tors read it over his shoulder. "They're not shutting it down," she said. "They're asking." "Yes," Brant said. "Which means they can't shut it down anymore. Or they're choosing not to." "Does it matter?" He thought about it. "No," he said, "I don't think it does." The 48-hour hold was not a hold. 3 more ships filed Article 7 reviews in the first 18 hours. Oscar, who had been in the library for 15 days doing what he did, reading, thinking, filing things away, produced a 40-page document in the 31st hour that was, as far as Brant could tell, the single most thorough legal analysis of the Accord of Silence, and its conflict with the Colonial Compact that anyone had ever written, or at least that anyone had ever survived writing, and had distributed on the open frequencies before anyone could stop them. 48 hours after the message from the Council Arbiter, another message arrived. This one was different. It was shorter. It did not cite regulations. It said, "The Council recognizes the pendency of the Article 7 proceedings. The Perseverance is released from its transfer order pending review. Deputy Director Han has been recalled." Below that, in what read like a separate paragraph written by a different hand, "The Accord of Silence is under internal review. A formal position on genetic expression in colonial populations will be issued through appropriate channels." Marin read it in her office and sat for a while in the dark, which was becoming a habit. She thought about the standing protocol and the 40 years and the children who hadn't been documented. She thought about the word review and what it meant, and how much work was still ahead of it before it meant anything real. But then she thought about Sasha in the medical bay at 3:47, holding her daughter for the first time. And she thought about Vale's eyes, the way they engaged with you, the quality of attention in them that recognized you as a specific person and wanted to understand you. She thought about the 17 children on Kepler 442b, who had the same quality of something else in their bones. Children who had been waiting for a transfer order to come through for 8 months while their administrator stalled, and the transmissions made their way across the dark. She thought about the fact that the species instinct, when it produces something new, has always been to look at it honestly. Not to look away, not to file it somewhere no one can find it, not to give it a clinical name and a facility number and a standing protocol, to look at it directly and say, here is a thing that has not existed before. Here is a thing we don't understand yet. Here is a new fact about what we are. That was the human thing. Not the victory. The victory was still uncertain. The review was still pending. And Marin was not naive enough to think that 40 years of institutional reflex dissolved in 15 days, but the act of looking, the refusal to participate in the silence, the insistence on saying, this child exists, and she has her mother's stubborn jaw and her father's careful hands and eyes that catch the light like something ancient and unafraid, and she has a name, and the name is Vale, and she is a fact. 3 days before the Perseverance reached Kepler Station, Dodo Kariuki sent the last transmission. She sent it on the open frequencies, unmasked, no packet signature, no emergency routing, just the signal going out into the dark on the old pre-council channels that humanity had used when it was still learning what it was capable of. It was a simple message. It contained the current number of Article 7 review filings, 68, and the current count of colonial children documented as displaying variant genetic expression, cross-referenced with the colonial registries. It contained Oscar's legal analysis. It contained the Council's message acknowledging the pendency of the proceedings. And at the end, after all of that, Dodo had added something Brant had not reviewed before she sent it, which he forgave her for immediately when he read it. She had added 12 seconds of video. Vale, 18 days old, awake in the medical bay, those extraordinary golden eyes wide open in the light, looking at something off camera with the absolute complete attention of a being that understood, in whatever pre-verbal way such things can be understood, that the world was interesting and specific and worth examining carefully. And then she laughed. Not the reflexive newborn response, but something that sounded, impossibly, like she'd seen something she recognized. A real laugh. Brief and bright and entirely her own. The transmission went out. Somewhere in the signals traveling between the stars, in the web of old frequencies that the Council had never managed to close down because they'd been laid down before the Council existed, in the distributed record of 68 ships and stations and colonies all saying at once, we see this, we will not be silent, we are looking, somewhere in all of that, a child laughed. And the Council, which had been very good at silencing individual voices for 40 years, found that it was less good at silencing a species. The Perseverance docked at Kepler Station on a Tuesday, station time 11:40. The docking went smoothly. The immigration clearance went smoothly. The medical reviews went smoothly. Deputy Director Hahn was, in fact, not there. She had been recalled to the Council's administrative center, presumably to explain how one colony ship and an old communications array had caused a procedural crisis that had now spread across 2 sectors and was referenced in 23 separate formal challenges to the Accord of Silence. There was no representative from Facility 7. There was no transfer order. What there was, which nobody had expected, was a crowd. Not hostile, a crowd in the way that colonies form crowds when something matters, gathered around the docking terminal screens, watching the docking live because the Perseverance had become, in 15 days, a name that people said the way you say the name of something you hadn't known you needed. A Council official, not Hans level, someone lower, someone who looked like she had been given this assignment at the last possible moment, and was handling it with the slightly dazed competence of a person who has been handed a situation they didn't train for, was waiting with a statement about the pending review and the Council's commitment to transparent process. Sasha came through the docking terminal with Vale against her chest in the carrier wrap that Marin had helped her figure out 3 days ago. Dav was beside her. The crowd, there were maybe 200 people, station residents and docked crew, and the children from Kepler 442b, whose administrator had brought them down from the colony to be here. Because the administrator had understood correctly, that presence was its own kind of statement. The crowd got quiet. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of the accord, the silence of attention, of recognition. Vale opened her eyes in the station light, which was different from ship light, warmer, more complex, the particular quality of light in spaces built for people to actually live in rather than survive in. And those gold vertical pupilled eyes moved across the crowd, and Sasha said something quiet to Dav and laughed, and the people nearest them could hear her say, "She's never seen this many people before." And the crowd, because they were human, because that is what humans do in the presence of a child who has laughed, the crowd laughed back. The Council's arbiter for Genetic Accord Review issued a preliminary statement 6 weeks after the Perseverance docked. It acknowledged, in careful language, that the current genetic documentation protocols required review. It acknowledged, in somewhat less careful language, that the accord of silence had been applied in ways that exceeded its original mandate. It did not acknowledge, yet, the full scope of 40 years, because institutions move the way glaciers move, not because they want to, but because that's how much weight they're carrying. But it established a formal genetic expression registry, open and public, the first of its kind. It suspended transfer orders to developmental assessment facilities pending review. It said, in a sentence that Oscar read 3 times in the library on the Perseverance, and then set down his coffee and went to find tours. The rights of colonial citizens to accurate information about themselves and their children are recognized as fundamental and not subject to suppression under any accord. Not subject to suppression. Tours found Brant on the bridge. He was doing something with paperwork, which is what captains do with the ordinary maintenance of things, the keeping on. She showed him the statement on her tablet. He read it. He read it again. "It's not enough," he said. "No," she said, "it's a start." He handed the tablet back. He looked out the porthole, which now looked out on the docking arm and the station infrastructure and the distant brown-gold curve of Kepler 442b, not transit darkness anymore but a destination. They had arrived. "She's going to have to fight for it," he said. "Vale, whatever she is, whatever this means, it's not going to be easy." "No," Torres said again, "but she's not going to be alone in it." He thought about 68 Article 7 filings. He thought about Amara Diallo on the Steadfast Promise, who had been carrying a secret for 2 years and had waited for exactly the right moment to not be carrying it anymore. He thought about Dodo adding 12 seconds of video to the end of a legal transmission and sending it before he could review it, and the entire species laughing. "No," he said, "she's not." Outside on Kepler Station, in a temporary housing unit that would be their home until the colony assignment came through, Sasha Aldrich was putting her daughter to sleep. Vale's eyes were closed. She was the size she was, which was small, which was the size all futures start at. She had no idea yet what her existence meant or what it would require of her, which is true of every child and which is probably the greatest mercy in the universe. That you get to be small and unaware for a while, that you get to just be a fact before you have to become an argument. Her mother hummed something without knowing she was humming it, a tune that had no name, that had simply arrived in her head one day on the long transit, that felt, she would say later when she tried to explain it, like something very old coming home. The stars were outside. The silence was over. The formal review process began 41 days after the Perseverance docked. Brant attended the first session via relay transmission because the Perseverance was already on its next run, out toward the second cluster, carrying a new cohort of colonists who mostly didn't know what the ship they were on had been through and mostly didn't need to. He attended in his captain's uniform, which he had pressed carefully that morning for no reason he could explain. There was no one to impress on the bridge relay, just Tors beside him and the transmission lag, and the faces of 7 council arbiters on the screen. The lead arbiter was a woman named Cho Sarin. She was in her mid-50s, with the particular stillness of someone who has spent a career reading the space between what people say and what they mean. She opened the session by noting the 68 Article 7 filings, the scope of the open frequency network, and the current registry enrollment numbers: 412 children, documented and formally registered in the 6 weeks since the registry opened, spread across 11 colony systems. 412, Brandt said when she had read out the number. In 6 weeks. 412 documented, she said, with the careful precision of someone who had been thinking about an iceberg and its relationship to water lines. The registration is voluntary and recent. We have no reliable estimate of the total population that may have gone undocumented over the past 4 decades. No, Brandt said, because they were transferred. There was a pause in the transmission. Cho Sarin's expression did not change, but something in it settled like a structure accepting its full load. Yes, she said, because they were transferred. The review of those transfers is ongoing and is being conducted under a separate process, which I'm not at liberty to discuss in this session. She paused again. I want to be direct with you, Captain. The Council's institutional posture toward the Accord of Silence is changing. The pace of that change is slower than you want it to be, and faster than certain elements of the Council are comfortable with, which probably tells you it's approximately right. What I can tell you today, formally and on the record, is that the transfer program has been suspended. Not under review, suspended. Brandt thought about the word suspended, which was different from terminated, which was different from destroyed, which was different from that never happened and we're sorry. But it was a specific word, said on a formal record, and specific words on formal records are how institutions are changed when the people inside them decide they have to be. And Facility 7, he asked. The pause this time was longer. The facility has been closed, Cho Sarin said. Its records are being transferred to the review process. She stopped. She was, he realized, choosing her next words with extraordinary care, the care of someone navigating between what she was authorized to say and what she believed should be said. I'm not able to tell you more than that in this session. After the session ended, Tors stayed on the bridge with Brandt. The relay screen had gone dark. Outside, the stars were doing what stars do, which is exist with complete indifference to the things happening in front of them, which is either humbling or clarifying depending on your mood. She knows what happened at those facilities, Tors said. Yes, Brandt said. And she's not able to say it yet. Not yet. Tors was quiet. Then, what do you think they found? He had thought about this. He had thought about it with the same careful deliberateness with which he had thought about everything in the past 2 months, trying to hold it clearly and look at it without flinching and also without catastrophizing, because both flinching and catastrophizing are ways of not actually seeing the thing. I think they found children, he said. I think the question is what state they're in. Tors nodded once. The conversation went somewhere neither of them spoke aloud, because the speaking aloud part came later, when there was something to say that wasn't just the shape of a dread. The shape of it, when it finally came, was better and worse than the worst versions Brandt had imagined. The review process produced its first public report 4 months after the Perseverance's initial transmissions. It was a long document, carefully written, and Brandt read all of it, which took him most of a transit day. Tors read it too, and then Oscar read it and produced 18 pages of commentary that circulated on the open frequencies and was read, as far as Brandt could tell, by an enormous number of people. The report confirmed what the Accord of Silence had suppressed, a 42-year program of genetic documentation and sequencing of children displaying variant expression traits. The program had originally been authorized as scientific research, understanding what the sequences were, where they came from, whether they posed any health risks. That was 2087. The science had quickly exceeded the Council's comfort level, because what the scientists had found was not a series of isolated anomalies, but a coherent pattern, a set of sequences that appeared to be ancient and deliberately structured, sequences that did not resemble any known terrestrial genome, but that also did not resemble anything in the Council's xenogenetic database. They had found, in other words, what Oscar had described to Tors on that first morning, evidence of something in the human genome that wasn't supposed to be there, that appeared to be latent and to express under specific conditions, and that corresponded in specific ways to the morphological signatures of the Vor. The species that the Council officially maintained had never existed. The Council's response, in 2089, had been to reclassify the research, establish the Accord of Silence, begin the transfer program, and spend the next 37 years hoping that the problem would remain small enough to manage quietly. It had not. The children transferred to developmental assessment facilities. The report listed 214 names, which was the number confirmed through the sealed records, had not been harmed. That was the better part. They were alive and had been, by most measures, well cared for. What the facilities had been doing was observation and ongoing sequencing, trying to understand what the expressed traits meant, what developmental trajectory they followed, what they eventually produced in adult subjects. The research had apparently been, by the standards of the people conducting it, responsible. The ethics of conducting it without consent, without disclosure, without any mechanism for the families to know where their children were or what was happening to them, were the subject of a separate proceeding that the report referenced but did not adjudicate. The worst part was the reason for the Accord's urgency, which the report disclosed in a section headed Contextual Background, that was the most careful piece of institutional writing Brandt had ever read. In 2086, 1 year before the research was reclassified, the Council had received a communication, not from another human source from outside, from a species that the report referred to by their Council designation, which was NE7, Non-Terrestrial Intelligence Category 7. The species that humanity's mythological traditions, across approximately 40 independent cultural lineages with no documented contact with each other, referred to as something that translated in most cases to the Old Ones, or the Elder Kind, or the First Fire, or, in the oldest surviving fragmentary records, simply the Vor. They had sent a message. The message, translated after 18 months of work, had said something that the Council had found profoundly alarming and which it had then classified at the highest possible level. The message had said, "We recognize what is waking in your children. We have been waiting. We would like to speak to your species about what comes next." The Council, in 2087, had decided that what comes next was not a conversation humanity was ready to have. Brandt read that section of the report 3 times. Then he set the document down and sat for a long time. He thought about Vale, who was now 4 months old and by all accounts developing normally if you bracketed the extraordinary attentiveness, and what Sasha described as an unsettling ability to communicate distress in ways that didn't involve crying, as if she had decided crying was an inefficient protocol and had moved on to more direct methods. He thought about the other 412 children in the registry. He thought about 214 names in a closed file. He thought about the Council's fear. He thought about it with as much generosity as he could manage, because he believed in trying to understand the positions of people you disagree with, because he had found that understanding them was the first step to actually changing anything. The Council had received a message from something ancient and unknown, saying it recognized what was waking in human children. Any institution responsible for the safety of a species, receiving that message, would be afraid. Any institution afraid in that way would want to control the variable, contain the expression, manage the interface, prevent the contact until it was better understood. He thought the Council had been wrong. He thought it had been wrong in ways that were catastrophic for specific families and specific children, and he thought the wrongness went beyond strategy into something more fundamental. A decision to suppress rather than face, to silence rather than know, that was itself a kind of cowardice, the institutional variety that is always dressed up as prudence. But he understood the fear. He thought about what Sasha had said in the medical bay in the first hours before anyone knew what was coming. She looked at me, like she already knew me, like she was older than she is and she'd been waiting. Something waking, that was the message's word. He thought about a species. He thought about what a species is, really, not in the political sense but in the biological historical sense. A thing that changes. A thing that started somewhere and has been becoming ever since, accumulating and drifting and occasionally throwing up something new, something that turns out to be viable, something that carries forward. He thought about the billions of years before humanity existed, and the specific improbable path that led to a small planet developing something that looked at the dark and wanted to know what was in it. He thought about the Vor, who had apparently been watching, who had waited, who had sent a message in 2086 saying, "We recognize what is waking in your children." He thought about the Council's decision, which had been to keep it small, to manage it quietly, to prevent any conversation. And he thought about what had happened instead. 68 ships and stations and colonies, an open-frequency network built from emergency broadcast protocols and old pre-council channels, a laugh from a 4-day-old child that had gone out into the dark and kept going. The universe, he thought, had its own opinion about what comes next. 6 weeks after the report, the Council issued its first public communication on the genetic expression question. It was not an apology. Institutional apologies are a different document, slower in coming, and this one had not arrived yet. It was a statement of position, and it said, in the measured language of institutions that have been forced to move, that the Council recognized the existence of the variant genetic expressions documented in the registry, recognized the rights of colonial citizens expressing such traits to legal personhood and full protections, and recognized the pending question of the 2086 communication, and what, if anything, humanity wished to do about it. That last phrase, what humanity wished to do, was the thing that stayed with Brant when he finished reading it. Not what the Council wished to do, what humanity wished. The question of the 2086 communication would not, the statement made clear, be a Council decision. It would be put to the colony systems through the established representative process. It would take time. These things take time, but the question would be asked, and the answer, whatever it was, would be humanity's answer. Tors, reading it beside him, said, "That's different." "Yes," he said. "They're afraid of getting it wrong." "Yes. That's better than them not caring if they get it wrong." He thought about that. He thought about the difference between fear as a motive for suppression and fear as a motive for caution. He thought about the 42 years and the 214 names, and the fact that he was alive in the aftermath of something that had gone very badly and was only now, slowly, being corrected, and whether the correction was sufficient for what had happened. He decided sitting there that sufficient wasn't quite the right frame. Sufficient implied an accounting that could balance out. What he was watching wasn't balancing. It was redirecting slowly, a massive institutional momentum that had been oriented in a wrong direction for 4 decades and was now under enormous pressure beginning to turn. It would not be enough for the families. It would not be enough for him. But it was a turn, and turns, when you are dealing with things of this size, are what you work with. On the day the Perseverance completed its second run under Brant's command after the Kepler docking, a message arrived from Sasha Aldrich. Vale was 7 months old. The message included a photograph, which was unusual. Sasha was not a sender of photographs. She was a sender of precise, information-dense text that got to the point and assumed you could fill in the texture yourself. But this one had a photograph, and the photograph showed Vale sitting upright, which was early, which was the kind of developmental milestone you noted, on a blanket on what appeared to be colony ground, actual earth, actual grass. The pale blue sky of Kepler 442 be visible above her. She was looking at something above and to the left of the camera. Her eyes were fully open. The gold was, in the photograph, more complex than Brant remembered, layered, with depths in it that shifted depending on the angle, not the flat gold of the mineral but something that moved. She was 7 months old and she was sitting upright, and she was looking at whatever it was she was looking at with the quality of attention that Brant had seen in the medical bay, that quality of utter presence, of something being learned. The message from Sasha said, "She started making sounds that aren't words but aren't not words either. Dav says they're just baby sounds. I know what baby sounds are. These aren't those. I've been recording them. Oscar says send them to him. The Xenolinguistics department at the Kepler Institute says they're interested. I don't know what she's doing or what she's going to be, and I won't know for a long time. What I know is that she's mine and she's here, and she's becoming something I get to watch happen." The registry is at 847 now. Did you see? New families registering every week. Some of them have older children, teens, adults, people who have been managing this alone for years without knowing there was a name for it or a community or anything. One woman, 43 years old, has the silver eyes and the pattern recognition that one of the retired researchers documented, and she's been telling herself for 20 years that she's just different, just strange. And she found the registry 3 weeks ago, and she's been in contact with us every day since, just wanting to talk to people who understand what she is. I think that's the thing, Brant. Not the council and not the vor and not what comes next in some large-scale civilizational sense. Just people finding out what they are and having somewhere to put it. That's what you built with the transmissions. You built a place for people to put it. Brant read the message twice. He was on the bridge and it was night cycle and the stars were outside doing what stars do. He wrote back a single paragraph that said, "I didn't build anything. Marin filed a report and Dodo had 4 hours and you held your daughter and refused to let anyone make her disappear. I just followed the order of operations." He sent it. He looked at the photograph one more time. A 7-month-old child sitting upright in colony grass, looking at something he couldn't see, with the quality of someone who understood that the world was interesting and worth paying attention to, and who was not afraid. The stars were outside. The silence was over. He went back to flying the ship.